I have Lieutenant Colonel Matt Lohmeier. Colonel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yep, happy to be with you.
So you've written a book, Irresistible Revolution. You've served the United States faithfully. You became the first veteran of Space Force after you were forced out of the military because of being vocal about some of the wokeness, the DEI. I want to go through a lot of that. I first became aware of you. You were at a Trump rally out in North Carolina. You had a chance to speak with former President Donald Trump about being in Space Force, losing things because of raising concerns about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Can you tell my audience about that? Like, how did you go from being a loyal member of the military to suddenly having your life disrupted?
Well, that's a good question to tee things up and a hard one to answer at a glance. So I'll do my best, and feel free to re-steer me as we get into this. But I do want to re-emphasize what you've said. I was a loyal, true blue, you could say, member of the armed forces who was grateful for my career. And it's important to emphasize up front, I wasn't a complainer. I wasn't murmuring against the senior leaders of the Defense Department all the way up until the time when I decided to write this book, Irresistible Revolution, that you're talking about. I was a loyal yes man of sorts who, like we are all trained to do as we become leaders in the armed forces. So whether you're a follower or a leader, I guess you're both throughout your entire career. I really tried to do my duty and to learn whatever obligations I had. At first, I was an F-15 fighter pilot. I was a T-38 instructor pilot, teaching kids how to fly jets in the Air Force before I ever joined the space community, and was doing the missile warning business for the Space Force. And everything on paper and otherwise was going very well for me in my career. My family was happy. I've got a wife and 2 kids. And we would have never suspected, even months before I was fired from my command and shortly thereafter separated without my pension from the military, we would never have expected that we would have come to a point in my career where, because I was expressing a dissenting viewpoint, not politically partisan, but a dissenting viewpoint from an administration's divisive policies about diversity and inclusion trainings, that I saw directly impacting my troops, that it would end up resulting in me losing my command and essentially, and I'm not overstating it, being kicked to the curb by senior leaders who knew my wife and kids by name. I mean, these people knew me well. I was an aide-de-camp for a 4-star general. I was on the fast track through promoting through the officer ranks, and I was bashful at first saying this, but because I've said it a few times, I'm becoming more callous, I suppose. I was the #1 ranked officer in uniform in my peer group in the Space Force. I promoted 2 years early to lieutenant colonel. I wasn't a chump, like I was trying to do my best, and they knew that. And so, yeah, I guess that's one way of scratching this itch and trying to tee up the whole conversation. I had a successful career before I saw terribly divisive partisan politics ripping the military apart. And when I blew the whistle essentially on that, I'm the bad guy all of a sudden because I wasn't towing a party line, which is it's really troubling, and it should startle the American people.
Okay, this diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've seen this in the corporate world as I've interviewed people. I've talked to other people in the military. I've talked to medical people in the military. They all have this same worry. Was this exacerbated and worsened under the Biden administration? Was this happening under the Trump administration? When did you first start noticing, wait a minute, the U.S. military, instead of being focused on a mission and purpose, you're starting to see this ideology creep with LGBTQ, 2SA plus issues, with promoting people based on skin color and what might look good to the press? When did you start noticing that?
I noticed it during the Trump administration, and the answer to both of your questions was yes. It was happening under both administrations. However, there's important context that matters. You'll recall that last time we had a presidential election that was on the horizon, same year, we had George Floyd's death and the coincident rioting, activism of BLM movement, Antifa, and a altogether ramped up demonization of President Trump. But there was a lot of talk at that time about white supremacy being a problem. Terms such as systemic racism were all of a sudden all over the airwaves. We hadn't been talking about it like forever, but all of a sudden it's a really big deal. We've got to root out extremists from even maybe our military potentially. That was something that began to be floated and investigated in 2020, if I remember correctly. And this was all while President Trump is in office and in the lead up to an election. And I remember I called a member of the Joint Chiefs who knew me well. I knew him well. And I said, we've got a terrible problem I'm seeing in the military right now. I'd just taken command, and there was political activism in the military workplace. And I said, it's really dividing our troops on both sides of the political aisle of all races. It didn't matter if they were Democrat or Republican. If they tended to believe in the divisive rhetoric that we've got a terrible country that's systemically racist, that demotivated them and disincentivized their further service. And on the other hand, if they didn't want to buy into all of these anti-American, what I call Marxist narratives of American history, some people don't find that an apt label, but I disagree. They too were disincentivized, demoralized, angry because they were tired of being called racist just simply based on their accidentals. If they happened to be a white male that was straight, they were starting to be demonized. And there was rumor and hint that, like, well, even if you don't think you have biases, we're going to sit you down next week and talk about your unconscious biases and your implicit biases, because after all, you're white and we know you've got terrible problems going on in your psyche. That was all starting to happen in the military in 2020 while Trump was president. But he heard about that through direct feedback from both uniform service members, senior leaders, and from other leaders in the federal agencies. And President Trump issued an executive order on September 22nd, just for now within a month and a half of an election. On September 22nd of 2020, the executive order banned, I think, what was called sex and race-based scapegoating and stereotyping. And he specifically mentioned in that executive order critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion training, ideology, and whatnot. That gave the military professional a bit of relief for a season, and then the election transpired, and you had several months of uncertainty in senior military leaders about, who's going to end up being the commander-in-chief. Day one of the Biden-Harris administration, through executive fiat, diversity and inclusion trainings was restored to the military and all the federal agencies, and it's been there ever since. And so the answer was yes, it was present in the Trump administration, and that's when I noticed it immediately, coincident with and after George Floyd's death. It was a crisis to be seized upon, or a crisis to be made, if you will, for the political activists. But also, it really came back with a bang and to stay during the current administration, during the Biden-Harris administration, because of policy, because it was... They've directed the Secretary of Defense. They've directed the Joint Chiefs through the Secretary of Defense and all senior leaders that this is the policy we pursue, and we will have recurring trainings on an ongoing basis about transgender sensitivity. We will have pride shows and pride parades. We will have things that show how inclusive we are. And I'll tell you, like, most of our troops just don't want to be distracted by that stuff, or they loathe it. And they say, we're here to serve our country. We're here to wear the same uniform. We're here to bleed the same color blood. And this is all not what we signed up for.
Yeah, I have to imagine when you're in battle and you're hoping someone has your six, you're not stressing about those things. But when there's downtime and it's being drilled into you over and over again, especially that unconscious bias of, just because you look a certain way, or you were born, or you have political leanings that you're automatically a racist.
Right.
I've encountered that in the real world, and it's uncomfortable. I had somebody tell me, well, of course you had slaves. You're white. It's like, there's no slavery in this family. Like we came here from England. We stayed up north. We went to Utah, nothing. And yet that in this person's mind, I was automatically a racist former slave owner. But again, I can't imagine that being drilled into me on a regular basis through emails, meetings, forced trainings. And that's how it was going on. Like these were like forced meetings. Today's economic environment is still really stressful for a lot of us, but with the Fed finally dropping rates, there is no better time than now to put you and your family in a better financial position. If you're a homeowner, American Financing is helping thousands of families just like you who have been putting everyday expenses on credit cards get out from underneath the debt by tapping into their home's equity. American Financing is saving their borrowers over $800 a month on average. $800 a month is like $10,000. Now, it costs absolutely nothing to find out how much you can save. They are closing some in as little as 10 days. And if you start today, you may not have to make the next 2 mortgage payments. There is no better time than now to turn your situation around. I want you to reach out to my friends at American Financing. Call 888-686-8030. That's 888-686-8030. Or visit americanfinancing.net/Gardner. All right, let's get back to this interview.
At first, I can't pretend that it's been a uniform application of activism at every base throughout every branch of the military, because every commander is different. And while I was in command, for example, in the fall of 2021 and on into the spring of 2020 and on into the spring of 2021 through 2 administrations, I was doing my best to shield my troops from political activism so that they could just simply focus on their mission, which was space-based missile warning. And some of it's unavoidable, however. And so when Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin takes the seat, which happened just in the weeks following the Biden administration coming into office, he went through some Senate confirmation hearings and was asked questions like, what do you think the greatest threats to this country are? And he mentioned white supremacy. He mentioned extremism. And by that, of course, he meant alt-right, MAGA, Trump-supporting extremism is what he had in his mind. That wasn't lost on our troops. He mentioned climate change, of course, and he mentioned the COVID crisis. Those were our biggest national security threats to our new Secretary of Defense. That just did not resonate with military men and women. Their sense of national security threats was so at odds with the talking points of the Secretary of Defense that it didn't matter what their political parties were. They're thinking, like I've read the national security strategy, if they had. I've read the national defense strategy. What about those countries that are like great power actors that we've been preparing to fight against for my whole career, like China and Russia or Iran or North Korea or the global terrorist threat we heard about for 20 years? That's the first thing that comes to our troops' minds, not global warming and white supremacy. So he comes into the seat as the new Secretary of Defense, and he immediately issued a memorandum to all commanders and senior enlisted leaders obligating them to stand down from all training and take a I'm going to call it a day off. That's not what we call it in the military, but you're going to take a knee. You're going to have a stand down day, and we're going to talk about extremism in the ranks and how we can solve white supremacy and extremism. And so for 2 months, you had this window in which you could do that. My troops and I took a knee because we were obligated to affirm in writing that we had taken a knee and discuss things. And I spent the entire day not talking about the threat of white supremacy, which would have made me lose the respect of just about every one of my troops. But instead, mentioning that extremism takes many forms, but now we're going to spend our day studying the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and the greatness of the American ideal, because after all, you've sworn an oath to support and defend it. So, like, let's learn a little bit about it. And oddly, a couple of people really had taken issue with my approach, because that's not what we were directed to do. So, the question that you asked was, is this how it's happening? Is it a monthly thing? Is it a quarterly thing? And the answer is all of the above, depending on the base and the leaders. But I'll tell you, it almost doesn't matter. The more I've reflected on this, it doesn't matter if you encounter this 3 times a year, 4 times a year, or once a month while you're in uniform, because it's just simply, it's perceived by the overwhelming majority of men and women in uniform as a distraction. And the last thing troops think about when they deploy downrange is, man, I sure wish I had one more diversity and inclusion training, or one more transgender sensitivity training. That would have really helped me prepare for the bullets flying. And they just don't. That's far removed from the warrior ethos and psyche that our troops desire to have instilled in them. And so, yeah, I shared this to the offense of some of the people that were in attendance in Phoenix at a luncheon 2 weeks ago. I won't swear on your program, but there was a service dog in the it's not a cafeteria, in the room, the banquet hall where we were having lunch, and they were all eating salad while I spoke. And I've heard this feedback, like, well, if it's only once a month, or if it's only once a quarter, like, is that really spoiling military culture? And I said, how would you like it if there was 1% dog crap in your salad that you're eating that came from the service dog sitting over here? It would ruin the entire thing, because it's not supposed to be there. And when men and women, it doesn't matter the percentage, it doesn't matter how often it shows up. When men and women swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution, and they expect to serve their country faithfully and to love their country and to be patriots, so to speak, I mean that in a neutral sense. They don't want to have that spoiled by accusations or allegations that they're a problem somehow, that they're a threat that the American people should be concerned about, or that the other, who is a different race but who happens to be wearing the same uniform right next to them, might be a problem. They might be out to get you. Blacks don't like it. Whites don't like it. I don't care who it is. Like, most people just, it doesn't resonate with them.
Yeah. Okay. During that interaction with former President Donald Trump, he mentioned, he didn't mention the September 2020 executive order that you did, but he said, that he did not want to see that kind of stuff, and that would like to see you on a task force. Yeah. I know we talked about this off camera. I assume he's extremely busy trying to beat Kamala Harris, sorry.
And Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, both of them. Kamala Harris, and then he'll have to go through a transition. But do you see him circling back around to having some kind of task force that addresses this with the military? Because he's been pretty clear about 2 genders, no men and women's sports, focusing on making the military strong. Do you see him circling back to this task force idea?
Yes, I do. In fact, I had several people approach me backstage after the event who were about to jump on the plane with him to leave. They said how excited they were that he had mentioned that, and that when he does things like that, he tends to keep his word, because he very much believes in what he's saying when those kinds of moments arise. I had a sense as I sat there having this face-to-face interaction with him on stage that he felt. I'll put it in 2 different ways for the diversity of your viewer or listener here. It's that he has a good business gut sense when he wants to make a quick, decisive judgment call. And I think he felt in his gut, like, what this person is saying and suggesting, that we need persistent oversight of this problem. I think he's right, and I'd like to make that a reality. So he had a business sense for it, but he also had a spiritual sense, I think, because I felt it, and I'm sensitive to that kind of thing. I quite literally, there was a moment where I stood on stage, and I had a spiritual moment where it was clear to me that that something was happening that was authentic, natural, uncontrived, unplanned, And the moment I began to feel it, I noticed in his face and eyes and demeanor that he sensed it. And so that's not just a business gut decision. There was this moment where he recognized that there was a spiritual aspect and component to what was involved, if that makes sense. And he meant what he said. So you're right. He's busy. There's a transition team and teams and a transition period. And there's a lot of people and jobs and tasks to sort through. I don't think this is the kind of thing that gets dropped by his team. In one sense, you've got the right, if you get the right Secretary of Defense in place, if you get the right senior leaders, let's say superintendents at our military service academies in place, or in any of the federal agencies for that matter. In one sense, in theory, you don't need a task force like I suggested because they clean things up. However, in the case of a Secretary of Defense, we have an overabundance of complicated threats on the world stage. They enter a complex environment, and the last thing they should really be attending to is the kind of thing that I envision this anti-woke or anti-DEI task force should really be involved in, and ensuring it doesn't rear its ugly head in the next 4 years. They can issue memorandum or a policy directive that shocks the system, so to speak, right when they get into the seat. The Secretary of Defense, for example, might issue a memorandum that says, hey, within 60 days, every senior leader, every general officer and flag officer will affirm in writing that they've abolished all DEI trainings in their units and eliminated all the vestiges of critical race theory, anti-Americanism, racism, whatever, and that can be done, and it will shock the system. And a few people need to be court-martialed, quite frankly, which is another topic. But then beyond that, you've got an entrenched bureaucracy of unelected officials, civilians in many cases, who wait out administrations to pursue their agenda. There's big money involved. And our senior military leaders simply don't always know who all of those people are. And the utility of a task force is that if they're unencumbered by the kinds of serious real-world military threats that the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs, the service secretaries, and so forth ought to be focused on a daily basis, real war fighting and organizing and training and equipping troops to fight wars. If there is a task force unencumbered by all of that and solely focused on being a watchdog for a season, and I'm not saying it needs to be a permanent fixture, 1 year, 2 years, 4 years, I think that team can go a very long ways in uncovering a lot of rot that we've got in the system and send a loud and clear message that we're interested in refocusing the military. And so, yeah, I think it's entirely possible, as I've thought through it, that this isn't going to go away. Whether or not I'm put in charge of it's a different question. Whether or not I'm in any way in a influential or powerful position to make impact is a different question. But I do believe Trump thought he envisioned me on that.
Okay. Yeah, just on the Joe Rogan podcast, he said one of the hardest things was he gets elected, he goes to D.C., he's literally never slept in D.C. Suddenly he's the president and the most powerful person there, and they tell him, sir, you've got to hire over 10,000 people like right away, and he was like immediately overwhelmed by all of it. I know they do have a transition team this time, and they are being very careful on who they get on.
Yes.
That. But, from other comments that he has made, I also get the feeling that he does not like General Mark Milley, and
true.
anyone who behaved or led or governed like a Mark Milley would probably be reviewed and removed. He's always talking about how incredible the men and women in the military are, but not the ones on TV, you know? So I could see him doing a shakeup with leadership, senior leadership, Joint Chief of Staff, Pentagon, things like that, once he gets in. One thing I've always wanted to understand better, Colonel, is why was Space Force created, and what exactly does it do? I think most people understand Navy, Marines, Army, Air Force. What is the reason for Space Force?
Well, now you're going to get into the realm of aliens. This is going to get really exciting. You've asked one question, but I want to answer two. So let me just back up for a moment to the Mark Milley topic. I did a radio interview a couple of days ago with a show in Baltimore, and because I wasn't on camera, I got up while I was on my phone and I went and grabbed a book off my shelf over here by Bob Woodward called Peril that was written several years ago. And I read from a transcript of a private, personal cell phone conversation on an unclassified line that Mark Milley had with Nancy Pelosi several weeks before Biden took office and Trump was still in the seat. Your viewer needs to appreciate that the sole, almost exclusively, the sole job of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is to provide national security counsel or advice to the president of the United States, the commander-in-chief. He's not leading any troops. He has no command authority over any of the troops, although he's the senior ranking general officer or flag officer who sits in the chief's seat in council with all of the Joint Chiefs and works very closely with them, of course, and the service secretaries. But he advises the president. He is conspiring in a phone call, and that's not, I'm not putting it, I'm not exaggerating this. He's conspiring with Nancy Pelosi on how to keep access to the nuclear codes and the nuclear football from President Trump in the couple of weeks before the what turned out to be J6, before the transition period. And she's demanding of him answers about practically how it is that he's going to keep the president from access. We don't want him doing anything radical like blowing up nuclear weapons, which is just totally absurd, as if Trump was indicating in any way that he was going to be detonating nuclear weapons anywhere on the world stage. About the same time that this is going on, we have revelations that he was in contact with his Chinese counterpart, giving the Chinese counterpart over there assurances that if we were ever to attack China or be contemplating conflict with you, I'd make sure I'd let you know in advance so that you weren't taken by surprise. That's a lot of heavy words have been thrown around to describe this kind of behavior, but at very least, whatever the words we want to apply, there's law in place that it seems very clear that he violated. And he certainly violated a trust in his obligations. So he needs to be recalled and he needs to be court-martialed. The court-martial is not a verdict. A court-martial is a process. It's a hearing. And all of that evidence that he so happily bragged about and shared with Bob Woodward and other authors, journalists, etc., needs to be reviewed and brought up in a court, and he should be tried. So I wanted to say that. I don't even like it. You should, and your viewer needs to know, like, I don't even like when people throw around words like treason. They throw around words like, well, all sorts of big words, espionage and whatnot. And those are big words. Most people don't understand, even in law, what it means to be guilty of those things. But if in fact, in George Washington's day, someone was considered guilty of treason, or even in the Civil War day, like, you just drag them out and shoot them. You drag them out and hang them because they're threats to the Republic. And but we've got a complex time. The world's a very different place, culturally and politically, and in every other way, we're very different. And but there's nothing overly aggressive or overreactionary about court-martialing someone or trying someone. And so I want to make that clear. Now back to the Space Force and aliens. Most of the jobs that we do in the Space Force were done by the branch of the military called the U.S. Air Force. The Space Force was, it's been referred to derisively by President Trump's enemies as Trump's Space Force, because it somehow like makes it seem like it's not serious. But in fact, Space Force had been an idea toyed around with by theorists since while the Cold War was going on. And in 1999, I want to say, there was something called the Rumsfeld Commission report that was investigating the stewardship of the Air Force over space capabilities, among many other things. And there was a suggestion in there, a soft suggestion, that maybe there ought to be a new branch of the military for space. And then you had bipartisan support, a Democrat from Tennessee named Cooper, and a Republican from Alabama named Rogers, were both in favor of creating a new branch of the military called Space Corps that would function in relationship with the Air Force, like the Marine Corps does with the Navy, kind of be embedded within. And that's the model in a way. that we've currently got in our Space Force. It took on a new name. Trump and Pence and advisors thought Space Force sounded better, but it is embedded as a branch of the military under a civilian Secretary of the Air Force, and it falls within the Department of the Air Force. And all of the capabilities that belonged in the space domain, and things like GPS, which was done by Air Force, things like strategic communications and missile warning, all of those things we've done from space were just relabeled, rebranded, had a handoff and a transition into a new branch of the military. Many of them continue to operate out of the same locations that they did while they were in the Air Force. They've just been rebranded. And President Trump championed the idea in 2018 publicly, surprised General Dunford, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time, surprised Secretary of the Air Force Heather Wilson. And there was a lot of arguing that ensued for a year and a lot of pushback as people tried to stop that from happening. But in the end, they complied. Congress had to vote on it. It's not something a president can create. Congress has to create a new branch of the military. And the vote for a Space Force received bipartisan support, and it was voted by Congress in favor of it. And it was written into Title 10 of the U.S. Code and became an actual branch of the military in December of 2019 while Trump was in office. And it will remain a branch of the military regardless of the administration that comes in. Now, the exciting thing is, in addition to what the Air Force had been doing in, through, and from space, the Space Force took on all of those things and yet has other mission sets or capabilities that that the American people likely haven't heard of before. Generally speaking, that's true, and that have not been publicly disclosed. I've got friends who are put in charge of units doing things that no one knows about, and and we have threats in China and in Russia, specifically, that have developed very capable space satellites. And one of the purposes of the Space Force was to combat the rising threat in the space domain. It's a high ground of sorts. It's a high ground in intelligence gathering. It's a high ground in weapons employment if a country were to decide to do that. So overall, that's what the Space Force is really up to. It's trying to secure that new domain. They're treating space as if it's like the air domain, as if it's like the sea domain. And now we've got a military who's got control of its own budget decisions. And it's not just left up to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force to decide how much money gets sent over to space domain assets. And if the F-22 or the F-35 happens to be falling short, we'll just pilfer billions of dollars from the up-and-coming space satellite. So you can't do that anymore. You've got a chairman, you've got someone sitting on the Joint Chiefs, not a chairman, a chief of space operations who sits on the Joint Chiefs and has real direct inputs now into the space budget for our national security space purposes. So that's very, I guess, high level what that Space Force is doing.
Okay. I mean, when I first heard about it, I thought it was pretty smart. Space is a big area.
Yeah.
There's talk about attacking nations with weather, attacking nations with missiles from space. EMP bombs exploded over a nation. I mean, to me, it didn't seem like something funny. It seemed like, wow, this actually makes sense. We're, rocket technology and other things are only getting bigger and bigger. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I always wanted to just understand that better because I always thought it was a serious idea, not a comical idea.
Very serious idea. In fact, I'll say the only thing comical is, Steve Carell, I've never even watched, what is that? Was there a show on Netflix called Space Force?
Yes, I watched the first season, but not the second season.
Yeah, I heard that a lot. It never really appealed. And that's theater. It's supposed to be funny, and maybe it was. But unfortunately, it's not even comedy. It's kind of tragedy. You had this opportunity you had a new branch of the military that you could brand in any way you want. They did a pretty good job with branding, but their optics they've destroyed because at the time they're firing someone like me, who's a leader in the space community, for exposing how divisive diversity and inclusion trainings are. They're making a transgender colonel, a guy turned woman, their poster child in the Space Force. He's an activist. He's public. He goes and he speaks, and he gets boatloads of negative attention from the American people. real good way to really forge your new cultural identity on the world stage as a new branch of the military by having a transgender activist shame people into inclusivity and diversity values and all of the stuff we've been talking about and we've been hearing about. They've really done themselves a disservice. And I think it's possible, as Trump mentioned on the Joe Rogan podcast, he said something like Space Force, that's going to be a really important thing in the future. And I think he's right. That's something that is in a military sense undeniable, but people aren't going to want to join that Space Force or stay in it if they don't feel like others take that branch of the military seriously.
Yeah, no, I mean, a good example of that is even within the armed services, there's this idea, oh, the Marines are the toughest, or, you know, there's like these cultural ideals or ideas. And, you know, if the Marines is on one end and Space Force is the silly one on the other. But I mean, look at how much we're putting satellites into space. Look at espionage. I mean, there's just so many things. That is a real realm that needs to be protected, especially as communication and warfare could ramp up. You've put in the time with the military, you put your life on the line. Any thoughts on Kamala Harris being in charge of the border, Biden seeming to turn a blind eye as the United States is invaded by what some believe is upwards of 15 million illegal immigrants, and yet suicide rates are on the rise in Border Patrol. They're threatening to walk away if Donald Trump doesn't win the election because the stress of not only trying to control the border, but having to do the exact opposite of the thing you swore an oath to.
Right.
Any thoughts on this border invasion from a military perspective?
There are two things that just about every country on earth is willing to commit their treasure to and shed the blood of their own people over: their own political sovereignty and their territorial integrity. For the life of me, I can't understand why we've essentially wittingly destroyed our territorial integrity, unless we're not the ones calling all of the punches. I don't believe that Joe Biden's always been that foolish, although I think he's pretty much he's in a weak state right now. That's putting I'm the thoughts I have going through my mind. I'm measuring what I say. Kamala Harris, I think, is a fool and is unimpressive in just about every way you can imagine. That's my view as a military veteran. It's my view as a concerned citizen. And I just can't believe we're at a state in American history where people like that can end up vying for the chief seat and this seat as the chief executive when they've done nothing but unravel our national security through policy, through neglect. And I wouldn't blame a Border Patrol agent from walking away from their job if she ended up in office again, because these people have families to provide for. Go get a different job, and if they're not going to let you do your job, why would you continue to risk your life and waste your time and be on the watch when those people are invading the country? So, I think there are ways to fix a border and fix it really quickly. But you have to have the will to do it. And many countries around the world have put up fences, highly technologically advanced security systems. They man them with arms and they make sure people don't cross because they don't want invaders coming into the country. But we've all but allowed foreign invaders to trample us underfoot for the past 4 years. I'm not saying that illegal immigration wasn't a problem before that. Of course, it's been a problem for a very, very long time, but we're unhinged at the moment. So that is one of the most serious threats to our existence as a country. It's not just about some immediate national security threat. There's that too. But in many ways, it threatens the survival of the United States on even after a Trump election as put back in office. And they've talked about mass deportations and whatnot. I just heard a funny clip from Tom Homan that it's funny, but it's because he's being dogged for it on one side and he's being praised for it on another. But Tom Homan, the former ICE director, he was questioned by a reporter. Maybe you saw this clip. And she says, is there any way to deport people from this country without dividing up families? He says, yeah, deport whole families.
Yeah.
It's like, well, yeah, there's pretty common sense solutions to a lot of the problems we face, but we don't have the stomach for some reason these days, or the will to accomplish it. This will tell you where I stand on a number of things. This is almost inappropriate to invoke this in this conversation, but Israel was attacked last year in October by terrorists. And Vivek Ramaswamy, who was running for the president at the time, was asked, how would you solve this problem? And he's always quick-witted. Some people didn't like his response. I thought it was brilliant. He said, I'd round up 100 leaders of Hamas and I'd decapitate them and put their heads on stakes all outside of the border that separates Gaza from Israel, and we'd be done. And I thought, see, that's old school. That's like something out of Game of Thrones or The Last Kingdom or something else, these movies people watch. But it would have been swift, it would have been just, and it might have prevented a lot of treasure and blood from being spilt and a lot of civilians from being further injured. And yet there's an ongoing conflict. Israel just attacked Iran, and missiles constantly are being lobbed from Lebanon and Yemen and Iran and elsewhere into Israel. So there are simple solutions to tough problems that we face. We rarely have, we rarely find a leader with the will to execute a sound strategy that can really solve those problems. It will take drastic efforts to clean up our border at this point. Kamala Harris is not the person to do that. And then you visit every other policy issue we've got to, address. But to say I'm not impressed is an understatement.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I do think that there are things that can be done to clean up the border very quickly. Like, for one, just allowing Border Patrol to do the thing they signed up to do. Make an announcement to the world. We're not open anymore. Go away. We're not giving you money. Like, how many of these illegals would just leave right now if they weren't getting better benefits than our veterans and our senior citizens? That's one of the things that angers me the most. I think, okay, if I had to prioritize them, the number of children being trafficked, that makes me sick and angry. The number of women being violated to make it to the United States, that makes me angry.
Yep.
Then they get into the country. They're taking over the hospitals, the school systems. They're depleting our social safety nets. And then you have veterans and seniors who have given their all to their country, or they've worked a full life career, and they're getting half as much money and a fraction of the benefits of illegal immigrants. It's just such a slap in the face to me.
It's unjust. And in fact, the preamble of the Constitution that our troops swear an oath to support and defend, that our Border Patrol agents and many other federal agencies, officers are swearing an oath to defend. The preamble of the Constitution makes it very clear that one of the purposes of the Constitution was for the establishment of justice. And all of the other ways in which the Constitution supports, sustains, upholds, undergirds the civil society in this constitutional republic, all of the other ways in which our country is sustained and remains permanent and viable are only possible if you retain justice, is what I'm trying to say. Once justice is lost, and people often talk about a two-tier justice system, the unfairness of it all, the slap in the face you just mentioned. If you lose justice, you lose your ability to govern. And we live in a very complex society with tremendous problems. You can't have justice go out the window and retain control and your ability to govern affairs in a civil society. The civil society collapses. And that has to be, there's another word for this that's very much related that people have talked about with me as they've contemplated the possibility of me joining or leading some task force that's anti-woke, anti-DEI. They say we need to restore accountability. That's the word they use, to the Defense Department. It's very much related to this idea of justice. You need justice if you're going to survive. And that is not just some archaic term. I don't just mean that in the sense that I was referencing Vivek Ramaswamy's earlier comments about putting heads on sticks. You need justice, genuine justice and fairness, and that's, this country was built on the ideal of justice, and we've aspired for that, and it made us a tremendous nation. But that's in jeopardy right now.
Yeah. In our final minutes together, tell my audience about your book, Irresistible Revolution, and then I want to put a direct link to it down below.
Thank you. Irresistible Revolution. Someone just criticized it recently, which I chuckled at. They criticized the title. They said, your book is phenomenal, but you titled it like a master's thesis. And I just, the last year before writing it, had come out of a master's program. The subtitle says a lot. Marxism's goal of conquest and the unmaking of the American military. That's what the book is about. What I wanted to do is provide an academically rich but readable explanation of how the lineage of Marxist thought is tied to the present moment of wokeism. I don't use that term in my book because it wasn't in vogue in 2021. I hadn't heard it. How that lineage of ideas fed into and is manifest in all of the current social justice activism that we're seeing, the Black Lives Matter movement, and in the trainings that are destroying and dividing our military. That's what the book is about. But it is, I frankly could have started the story with Cain and Abel and the Genesis account, but I didn't. I left that chapter out of the book. I jump right ahead to mostly 1848, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels' Communist Manifesto. I trace through the 4 sections of the Communist Manifesto, I quote sections of it and then try and put it in plain English for people so they understand the aims, which is to sow division, to create an oppressor versus an oppressed narrative of human events and affairs so that people will grow enough animosity in their gut to go and kill the other and topple regimes. That's the intent of communist revolutionary ideology. And it is the undergirding spiritual impulse of everything that we see unraveling in society today, whether or not people are true believers or just useful idiots, to use that turn of phrase. So that's what the book is about. And it's also a warning that if we don't abandon this path, we will kill each other. And I urge people not to take up the sword in a literal sense against their neighbor, but to try and be the thing and the kind of soul that that the enemy wants to destroy, because it's our last best hope as Americans of buying ourselves more time. Be repentant, be God-fearing, be lovely, and use your voice to speak the truth and not your weapons, because you don't want to live in a society where free speech has failed. So that's the, and now I'm getting a call that I have to turn off.
No.
There. So that's the overarching storyline of the book.
Okay. I'm going to put a direct link to that, as well as Twitter and your website.
Thank you.
Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeier, thank you for your service to our country. Thank you for continuing to fight for the American people the best way that you know how. I appreciate you taking time out of your day, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
It's always a pleasure when someone just lets me start rambling on air, so I'm grateful I got to be with you for just a little bit. Thanks.
Hey, thank you so much.